ADAMA, the African Diaspora Art Museum of Atlanta, is reimagining what it means to build with culture at the center. Through exhibitions, education, and community engagement, ADAMA connects art to identity, belonging, and placemaking. As Atlanta grows, this museum is helping to ensure its soul grows with it. Explore the mission at adamaarts.org.
On this edition of Create the Village.
So the big provocation of our research was, what if we could change the meaning of square footage? What if we could make a smaller square footage feel and act as if it was much larger?
This is Create the Village, a podcast about the intersection of public policy and community development.
My name is Egbert Perry. I'm the CEO and founder of the Integral Group, a real estate company that focuses on creating value in cities and rebuilding the fabric of communities. Housing affordability is one of the most urgent challenges facing our cities today. Home prices continue to rise. Labor shortages are slowing construction, and traditional home building methods are struggling to keep pace with demand. If we're serious about expanding access to housing, we certainly have to be open to new ideas, approaches that improve efficiency, reduce costs, and meet the evolving needs of the market. One company tackling this challenge from a fresh angle is 𝘺𝗺. Today's conversation brings together Jordan Jones, who leads Integral's work in the Carolinas, and Hasier Larrea, CEO of 𝘺𝗺, a company reimagining how we live in and move through space. 𝘺𝗺 uses automation and intelligent design to make small spaces more functional, more flexible, and more livable, without increasing square footage. The premise is simple. If we can use space more efficiently, we can build more affordably and make housing more accessible in the process. But can innovation like this truly shift the needle on affordability and construction productivity? That's the conversation Jordan and Hasier take on, digging into the constraints that hold the industry back, the ripple effects of a shrinking workforce, and the role technology might play in reshaping the future of housing. So let's listen in after this word from our sponsors.
Home prices in Atlanta keep climbing, but one local organization is helping families stay. The Atlanta Land Trust makes home ownership possible for working families through permanently affordable housing in the city's fastest changing neighborhoods. It's a smart, community-first way to keep people in the places they call home. See how it works at atlantalandtrust.org.
Want to break into real estate or expand your deal flow in South Florida? BRIC, the Black Real Estate Investment Council, based in Miami, is where investors, developers, and lenders meet to move projects forward. Backed by the Black Professionals Network, BRIC is bringing the city's brightest minds together to build smarter. Check out what's happening at mybpn.org/BRIC.
Welcome to Create the Village. Today we're joined by Hasier Larrea, founder and CEO of 𝘺𝗺. Hasier has led 𝘺𝗺 in developing innovative, modular furniture systems that transform how people use space in urban environments. His focus on functional, flexible design for modern living addresses real challenges faced in cities with limited space. Hasier, let's start at the beginning. What led you to create 𝘺𝗺?
Hey, Jordan, how are you? The creation of any innovation, it's always a messy process. In my case, I was lucky enough to get to a place called MIT Media Lab in Boston, which is a place famous for innovating and creating, an environment where engineers, architects, programmers, magicians, lots of types of innovators come together. And I was lucky enough to be at a group called City Science, which was about the future of cities and how we can get the best of cities, that density and diversity that makes cities so attractive and that pushes social economic progress, but then try to solve the challenges of cities. And some of those challenges being, whether it's, carbon emissions or affordability. So in that context, a great group of engineers and architects, we started thinking about real estate. We started thinking about how to tackle those challenges around sustainability and affordability. And all that research through at least 5 years at MIT led to 𝗺𝗺𝗍 as a company. So it was an R&D project that became a company.
When did you spin it out officially as a company?
So that was 2015. It's almost been a decade after 5 years of work. And I think the reason for that, we realized as we were at MIT, we had great sponsors for our research. We had companies like IKEA, companies like Google, Samsung. But what we realized is that as you think about solutions like 𝗺𝗺𝗍 that really tie the world of architecture with the world of furniture, with the world of technology, with the world of real estate, we quickly realized there was no company out there that could be, again, a developer, a tech company, a furniture company, and an architect all at the same time. So then we realized there was room for a new, venture to be created. And that's why and how we created 𝗺𝗺𝗍 back in 2015.
And you mentioned around sustainability and affordability. Those are two key values that we too, as Integral, are looking to develop within our own development. So how exactly are you all getting there with what you just described earlier as the 𝗺𝗺𝗍 solution?
Yeah, so as we looked at cities and their challenges, and specifically real estate, we realized that lack of sustainability and lack of affordability are big, macro challenges. What I mean with that is that, when it comes to affordability first, we know that in, the top cities across the world, people cannot afford to live where they want to live. A lot of people are rent burdened. So that's been a big challenge that every city is very aware of. But at the same time, when it comes to sustainability, we've seen that, 40% of carbon emissions come from buildings. And when you think about the biggest culprits of that, whether it's materials, concrete, steel, or, heating and cooling, what we realized is that, or the big kind of, moment of the research was, as we're looking at this, was this realization that both of those problems are proportional to the amount of square footage that you use. Meaning, when you think about your rent or your mortgage, is proportional to square footage. When you think about carbon emissions, whether it's materials or heating and cooling, also proportional to square footage. So the big provocation of our research was, what if we could change the meaning of square footage? What if we could make a smaller square footage feel and act as if it was much larger? And that's why when we started 𝗺𝗺𝗍, the big slogan or the big kind of mission statement was to empower people to live large in a smaller footprint.
And so how smaller footprint? What size units is the 𝗺𝗺𝗍 solution allowing people to live in these days?
Yeah, so small is relative, meaning it's all about taking the average apartment sizes, and let's use the residential apartment, construct as an example. When developers build buildings, you tend to think about your typical studio, your typical 1-bedroom, your typical 2-bedroom. So just to use some, round numbers, the average studio in the US is about 450 square feet. The average 1-bedroom is about 750, and the average 2-bedroom is about, 1,150. So the way you think of these types of technologies and solutions that we develop, you would make a 450 square feet 300 or 280. You would make a 750 square feet closer to 450 or 500, and you would make a 2-bedroom at 700 instead of 1,100. So by shrinking square footage by 30, 40, 50%, you start tackling affordability very clearly, but there is a catch. And the catch is that if you just shrink square footage and you don't innovate, now you're just pushing people to live in tiny shoebox, prison cells, which nobody wants. And that's where technology comes into play. If we shrink those sizes by those amounts, but then we make them feel much bigger than they actually are, now you are providing affordability while also providing experience, but you're also providing more sustainability. And the interesting kind of synergy or balance between affordability and sustainability is that most people on their day-to-day, like individuals, they don't tend to make decisions based on sustainability. They tend to make decisions based on their wallet. But by making the affordable solution also the most sustainable, you are creating that kind of cost consequence where the most affordable solution is going to be also the most experiential, and it's also going to be the most sustainable.
No, that's great. Sounds like, again, these different unit types you're introducing, I guess what you will call expandable apartments, right, do not decrease necessarily the livability of the units. You're able to preserve the functionality of larger spaces and smaller footprints.
Yeah, when you say expandable apartments, I think that's something important to highlight because there's been a lot of branding in the past around efficiency apartments. We've heard things like micro units, which is the worst branding you could ever put to small apartments. And but you know, sometimes it's fair because a lot of those small apartments do feel micro. When we say expandable apartments, that's kind of the aspirational nature we're trying to bring to these smaller spaces. That if you were to stay in an apartment like that, you would probably not feel like that apartment has 100 or 200 square feet less because the space is thoughtfully designed and the space is really adapting to you and your needs.
So it sounds like you're enabling us as developers to stop viewing spaces as static, but as view spaces as dynamic or multi-purpose. So is there a particular example you can highlight of how exactly your furniture does this?
Yeah, so we like to think about it furniture, architecture, we kind of right in the middle because not only we do use, for example, beds that drop from the ceiling that you could consider robotic furniture, but we also use walls that appear and disappear, which you could consider more architecture. At the end of the day, just to make it as visual as I can, when people think about a floor plan, try to visualize your studio, 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom apartment. If you leave kitchens and bathrooms aside for a second, then the rest of the apartment, when you rent it, it's usually closets, walk-in closets, storage, it's beds or bedrooms, and it's walls. So what we are trying to do is reinvent each and one of those. Take walk-in closets, which are great when you use them, but for 95% of the time, they're unused. How can you make them more compact so that when you're not using them, they could completely collapse into a much tighter footprint? But then when you want to use them, they could expand and give you that Carrie Bradshaw, Sex and the City type experience of a walk-in closet. Now, when it comes to beds, of course, a bed is great. A bedroom is great when you're sleeping, but when you're not, it's just usually a bed, taking a full room. What if that bed could go up into the ceiling and leave room to, for example, a home office, a perfect, private home office in your apartment? And then when it comes to walls, what if you could be much more flexible around the use of walls? Everybody wants privacy, but if you live in a small 1-bedroom apartment and you're having a dinner party, you don't want to have half of your space completely unused. You want to be able to open up the full space and take advantage of all the square footage. So think about it in general terms. Think about it as a space on demand. We've talked about mobility on demand. We've talked about entertainment on demand via Netflix. Like, this is really about space. So take all those ideas of on demand and really bring them to a square footage and space.
No, that's great. And are you all seeing the deployment of the 𝘺rie solution in just kind of denser urban areas? You brought up New York City already once, kind of those larger cities. Or are you starting to see some deployment of 𝘺rie in some smaller communities?
So absolutely. Admittedly, when we launched the company, our first target or the first place where we thought these ideas would make the most sense were New York, San Francisco, Boston. But you would be surprised all the, secondary, tertiary markets where we've seen a ton of demand. We've had projects in Tampa, in Fort Worth, in Buffalo, New York. So we've seen that, at the end of the day, affordability at different levels, but it's become an issue in the top 50 kind of cities across the country. So sometimes markets that might not have the same rents as New York might have some more flexibility around, construction and entitlements, and might be actually a bit more open to innovation. So we've definitely seen some of our best case studies in markets that we originally did not think made that much sense. I like to use Fort Worth because Texas is in some way the land of the large and extra large, at least traditionally, and the fact that we had a building with 50 apartments under 350 square feet lease up in a month, that was an example that there's a lot of demand for affordability across the board.
Great. So in both kind of the Fort Worth, Dallas area and Tampa, I'm curious, what is the approach some of these your partners there are taking? Is it simply to decrease the chunk rents of these units, or is it more about increasing the density? By having these smaller footprints, you can increase the density, or is it a mixed strategy there?
Yeah. So at the end of the day, any approach that we do that adds some level of investment or technology needs to have a return. And that return is going to come through a higher price per square foot. Now, there are two ways to achieve that higher price per square foot. The first one is by going into traditionally sized units and adding this type of technology, which is a limited approach because you do have to add some level of chunk rent. So at that point, you're not tackling affordability that well. I mean, yes, you could make it feel like a studio, feel more like a one bedroom. So you could rationalize that your Studio Plus now feels more like a one bedroom, but still you're adding some chunk rent. So that is a strategy that we've done, but it's a little bit more of a hit or miss type strategy where sometimes it works really well, but sometimes it doesn't work that well depending on the market. The second strategy is the one that we are the most excited about, the one that we're spending most of our time on, is when you really shrink unit sizes, which allows you to add more units in a building on the same envelope. When you do that, you are still increasing the price per square foot, but you are doing it while decreasing the chunk rent. And that's where you create the true, I like to call it win-win-win, because you are decreasing the chunk rent, meaning you're bringing more affordability to residents. You are increasing the price per square foot, which brings more profitability to the developers that are trying to pencil these new buildings that are so necessary. But the third win is that you're actually making this while having people use less square footage per capita, which helps the planet. So now you have, these are the types of solutions that make the most sense, the ones where everybody wins. The residents win, the developer wins, and in this case, the planet wins.
Agreed. No, that's great to hear. I'm glad to see a lot of developers are buying into this, looking at this as a kind of a strong solution for their portfolios. I'm curious, so as you look to increase the unit count on the development site, how does that impact kind of the overall parking solution for the developments? And are you seeing these developments locating kind of in areas of transit-oriented development where they might have a light rail, a streetcar nearby, or in a walkable or bikeable distance to kind of key employment centers?
Yeah, so I would not say, we're fairly agnostic about, whether, we're in a transit-oriented zone or not, and the parking ratios change. We do tend to lean towards transit-oriented just because the economics of the building are going to work better if you add 20, 30, 40% more units and you don't need to add so many more parking spots. The economics or the additional yield you're going to generate is going to be much more attractive from a development spread standpoint. So definitely there's that better appeal there. But that doesn't mean that the numbers don't work in markets where the parking ratios are higher. Now, it does need to make sense, and you need to do a little bit of an analysis of, well, do we need to do underground parking? Well, that's going to add quite a bit of money. But if I'm also adding, a lot of revenue per square foot, the numbers might pencil. So it's all kind of case by case. As I said, admittedly, the lower the parking ratio, the more the numbers are going to sing and shine. But it doesn't mean that it does not work in high, parking ratio markets.
Great. Oh, that's very helpful. How has the overall real estate industry responded to 𝘺𝗺? Can you talk a little bit about number of cities you all are in, or number of buildings, number of units that have been deployed?
Yeah, so as of today, we are in more than 1,700 apartments, 30 cities, about 60 buildings. So this is not an R&D prototype from MIT anymore. We've been out there in the market. Of course, the industry is not the fastest adopting industry out there. We know it takes cycles and it takes time, because at the end of the day, you have these different stakeholders that need to be convinced that yes, start with the developer, but then move towards, the LPs, and then we end up with the lenders. So there's, all this ecosystem you need to convince, and it's an ecosystem that needs proof points. So I always say that the hardest deal, the hardest project is the first one. Once you do the first one, then the next 2 or 3 are, easier, and then the next 10. But then as a company, you're learning. So when you bring a new technology, and we compare this type of technologies to other innovations that happened, years ago, like the elevators, and how you think about things that are very intuitive right now and very obvious. They were not that obvious back in the day. So then you have to go through those pilots, make some mistakes in the sense that learn about what are the applications or the types of buildings where you make more sense or less sense, and then try to, with that feedback loop, try to get tighter on the offering. And that's how we've learned like where we make the most sense. And that's why we've been pushing lately to focus more on higher densification, smaller unit sizes, because that's where we see the best economics based on the track record and based on the history of having implemented solutions for a few years.
No, it's great to hear. And I was not aware of kind of how wide the adoption has been of these units. And I'm assuming this has been across the country, East Coast, West Coast, and Midwest, et cetera.
And Canada too. So we're in Toronto. But yeah, it's across the board. I would say, markets, if I were to look at the data, DC, LA, I think those probably are the markets with the most concentration. But then our biggest installation was in Oakland, in the Bay Area. Now we had a great case study in Tampa. We've been in Chicago, even Boise, Idaho. So we've seen quite a spread of applications. And we're just excited to take all those learnings from those initial 1,700 apartments and now start to apply them in a much more thorough and smarter way with all the data that we've been able to collect.
The data you're collecting, I'm curious, how are developers responding to your solutions? And are you having repeated relationships with some developers?
Yeah, absolutely. So the largest developer in this country and owner and manager and everything is probably Greystar. And that's been a great partner for us. We did a great project in Arlington with them, great success. Now we're doing a second project. So we're definitely seeing that kind of, repeat customer dynamic, which is always a good sign. With developers, there's developers that are ahead of the curve and there's developers that like to wait and see. So we see a little bit of that dynamic. I think the way we describe our strategy in very simple terms, like it might sound very exotic from a resident standpoint, robotic spaces, transformable spaces. But when it comes to development, it's much simpler than that. It's the combination of 2 proven approaches. The first one is what I like to call small format apartment multifamily, which is nothing new. It exists. There's plenty of brands that have been pushing sizes to be lower, whether it's micro apartments or just like a smaller 1 and 2 bedroom apartments. So there's plenty of developers that are already doing that. Let's call it square footage optimization. And then the second trend, which we've proven with 1,700 apartments, is the idea of square footage multiplication. And how do we make those spaces feel bigger? So it's basically about combining both. Of course, the developers that are already comfortable with the underlying asset, which is a small format multifamily, that's what you're building. And then you're adding the technology to make it really, this next gen building. The developers that are more comfortable with that are the ones that are adopting more. Because in development and real estate, as you know, and investment, it's always about downside protection when you innovate. So having that clear, baseline of a small format building that already works and it's in the market, that's very helpful. And that's the developers that we see adopting faster. The developers that are not comfortable with the smaller units per se, then those are the guys that need the most case studies and they need to see many more developers do it. So there's like tiers. The same way there's tiers to cities, for example, there's also tiers to developers of how you adopt this type of solutions.
No, that makes absolute sense. Thanks for sharing that. I'm curious, of the 1,700 units you all have, do you have a sense of kind of who the average tenant is that's willing to live in a Ouri solution unit? Is it kind of what I would imagine be young professionals, or are you all starting to see more diversity in terms of the residents?
So admittedly, on the first 1700, we skewed towards studios because that's the initial solution that we perfected. Now we do have new designs for 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, families, couples, but admittedly, those initial case studies is skewed towards, single renter households. The young professionals is the obvious kind of feed. We see a lot of first kind of solo renters, people moving to a new city, people that, might not have still that, everybody would love a 1 bedroom, even as a single, but you cannot afford it. And then as you look at these smaller apartments that are more affordable, they tend to be very difficult to furnish, because a micro space is kind of hard to figure out. But also the type of investment you would make on furniture is investment that usually you don't carry to your next bigger apartment. So we found that these, smaller, semi-furnished, very efficient apartments did have a lot of, connection to demographic. But then it's really market specific. So for example, we talked about Fort Worth or some other markets where we are very close to like medical centers. So we see, for example, a ton of traveling nurses. Not only that, but, a lot of people think of young people, but then there's, life is a little bit of the circle of life, So you see a lot of empty nesters going back to the city, divorced men or women, people are kind of building their lives, So you do see in those studios a lot of that. But as I said, now we're taking those designs and those tools that we use for studios and now implementing them into very optimized 1 bedrooms. So we can start talking about much more about couples, singles and couples at the end of the day, or, 1-2 person households or 70% of rental households. So with studios and 1 bedrooms, you're covering a lot of ground. But then also thinking about 2 bedrooms, thinking of families, like the same solutions we apply on the studios could be implemented into bigger apartments that are still optimized.
No, that's great to hear. I'm curious again, as you all have grown since 2015 to about 1,700 units, that's been a lot of scale, and it's been 9 years now. What are some of the challenges you've been seeing in kind of overall scaling of the business, scaling your demonstration projects and scaling some of these relationships? What are some of those challenges, and how have you been able to overcome them?
Yeah, so 1,700, honestly, it's still the tip of the iceberg, knowing how big residential kind of multifamily is. But it's really been the last 3 years after a lot of R&D and a lot of optimization of our products that we, in the last 3 years, we started pushing this type of volumes. When it comes to challenges, the life of a startup or rolling out a new innovation is the life of a struggle and the roller coaster of ups and downs. If I were to highlight, I would probably highlight one on the front end of the business and one on the back end of the business. The front end is really about real estate, multifamily, and how hard it is to adopt. And how, as a company coming out of, MIT and robotics and technology, initially you end up thinking that it's all about sounding exotic, sounding like a leap. And then we kind of learned that that's not what real estate wants to hear. You do want to create a leap on affordability or sustainability with your solutions. But when it comes to real estate, you need to understand that you have to be an incremental step. The more incremental of a step you can pitch yourself to be, the more success you're going to have. So it took us some time to learn that. And maybe initially we went a little bit too heavy on the let's disrupt real estate kind of messaging. And real estate doesn't want to be disrupted. That's the reality. So you have to do it almost with a different strategy. You can do it, but with longer cycles and in a way that it's a bit more incremental. So we learned that, but we had to learn, through pilots and immediately, when you try new things, there's some, we've always been very proud about our consumers and residents. They've always loved the apartments. But when it comes to the financial performance of some of these implementations, I could point to buildings where, the financial return was not there. And then we learned why was that. So going through that iteration and making sure that developers understand that process and now can follow us through a phase where we kind of figure it out. But you still have to kind of learn and make sure that people follow you through that story without losing them on the way. That's on the kind of more developer real estate relationships. On the operation side of things, I think people grossly underestimate how hard it is to think about the operations of a business that introduces, hardware, robotics. The idea and the product, in some ways, the easy part. In some ways, it's like you realize that the logistics and the processes that you need to envision in order to get to a building, delivering 150 apartments, show up with the trucks, do the, all the setting up of the packages on every room, do the installation. All of that is 10 times harder than designing the product. That's why, honestly, every time I see like a new company, some copycat kind of pitching what we do, I don't get very nervous, because that's the easy part. Like seeing some of our renders and copying some of our marketing messaging, that's the easy part. The hard part is to actually figure out the operations, the manufacturing, the installation, the service that goes behind the scenes in order to support a new approach like this.
Agreed. The one interesting piece there for me was hearing how much your growth has come in the last 3 years. So, right, my mind in the last 3 years is all about what we've been hearing and learning about from COVID, right? We're seeing this trend during the last 3 years of kind of working from home. I would have anticipated that there would have been less of an interest with your solution in the last 3 years from, again, people starting to spend more time in their units, not necessarily less time. So I'm curious how the COVID experiences all of our households had in the last few years, if it had any impact on kind of how you all have been approaching your spaces and how developers have been approaching you all.
I think COVID, when it comes to our business and the understanding of how important it is to make space feel bigger and better, was actually good. Like, it helped in the sense that until then, I think there was a lot of people that would rationalize living in a tiny dysfunctional unit by making the argument that, well, you know what, I don't spend any time at home. Hence, I just need a bed and that's fine. And my living room, my everything is the city. I think that we all came to a realization all of a sudden that that could change in a heartbeat, and that space had to work much harder for us. All of a sudden, during that period, apartments became, your apartment became your gym, your office, your kindergarten. So we realized, the apartment has to work much harder for us. So in some way, that trend, helped bring more focus into the importance of making a space feel bigger. Of course, now we're back to a little bit more of, exterior spaces and exterior amenities, but, people still do spend a fair amount of time at home, and a lot of people still work from home for a fair amount. And that's where spaces have to be designed in a way that they are designed to feel bigger. So again, I think it was an accelerant, if anything, or a catalyst to understand our solutions better.
No, that makes sense. And of course, also during the COVID, not only spending more time in our spaces, but of course, we all saw a drastic increase in rents. And so I'm sure the affordability piece you all were able to offer to help increase the overall supply in units and decreasing chunk rents was a key piece as developers were looking themselves at how to think about addressing affordability.
Yeah, I think that's been definitely a trend we've seen, although that trend has been accelerated even more in the last year or so, because what happened with COVID too is because of interest rates and because of, like how the financial markets operated. Developers could almost build anything. What we are seeing right now is that the need for innovation is becoming higher when the buildings are not penciling. Almost every building would pencil, 3-4 years ago, and now no building is penciling. So from a development standpoint, putting our developer hat on, I think we found that opportunity to, for many of these developers, become a must-have instead of a nice-to-have. If your yield of your building is stuck at a place where it doesn't pencil and no investor wants to invest in it, if Ory can bring that additional density, that additional affordability to tenants, that can bring you those additional 100 bips of development spread, then all of a sudden we become the reason the building happens. And that's a very good place to be in as a company. So in that sense, I think the last year and a half, we've seen much more of an acceleration because there's more pain. And the moment there's pain, pain and necessity are the mother of innovation. So that's kind of what we're seeing, even a better moment right now for us to innovate.
In terms of this pain in the market and driving the need for innovation, you talked earlier in the conversation about deploying, X number of units to different properties. Is you all's thinking or strategy still focusing on, number of units in terms of Ori solutions in a building, or are you all looking at kind of taking a step further and thinking about deployment of Ori solutions across the entire building to help a developer underwrite the transactions a little bit easier?
Absolutely. I mean, we're ambitious folks, so we're definitely moving towards full Ori buildings. We've seen the power of our brand in the last couple of years with residents and with renters, and a lot of residents, after leaving their building, remembering the Ori brand, but not remembering the brand of the building. So we've seen a lot of power that this type of new experience can create. So that's why, while we're still, looking to support, more conservative approaches where a developer could build a traditional building, but then maybe 20, 30, 40% of the building could be this optimized kind of Ori studios. I think we're excited to move up the food chain a little bit and be able to provide developers a much more comprehensive package where we could help them design, optimize not only studios, but 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, and do the basic math with the Ori toolkit. When you think about these optimized apartments, it's like new Lego blocks that allow you to think about a site differently. They allow you to do the Tetris game in a different way. And that Tetris game with these new blocks could unlock a new yield and new opportunities to make buildings pencil. So that's kind of where we're positioning ourselves, helping developers more on the architectural front, still providing all the technologies that make these solutions possible, but then also incorporating the power of brand that we've realized it's strong. There's no real super strong brand in multifamily. We do believe there's an opportunity to build a brand around making a smaller, more affordable, yet very, very cool.
No, that's great to hear. Seems like that would definitely be a very intriguing option, as again, construction costs likely aren't going to decrease anytime soon. And so as we all need to think about delivering additional units, additional opportunities, and that definitely seems like a great strategy for firms to look at.
Absolutely. The way we see it is that there's certain big unlocks that the industry needs, and it's not only Ori, but like a lot of projects are waiting on a drawer, hoping for interest rates to go down. But the reality is that even if interest rates go down, it's not like the building pencils all of a sudden. There's a lot of other challenges around rent growth, around construction costs, that it's a fairly complex situation. And we do need innovations that can change those cost bases or revenue bases like dramatically. And I know there's a lot of talk about prefab and modular, and I think there's something there. There's probably not as much talk around the stuff that we do, but size is one of the biggest levers you can pull. But you have to pull it in a thoughtful way. It's not just about shrinking sizes, it's about shrinking sizes thoughtfully.
Agreed. So, key theme here as well is kind of your continued focus on innovation in the space. So essentially as an urban innovator, I'm curious, for others that are looking to make an impact as well in urban living, what advice would you offer them on their journeys?
I always hesitate to give advice to people when I don't have advice for myself. But I think what I would say, if I had to say one or two things, the first thing to entrepreneurs in general, but it applies to urban entrepreneurs and real estate entrepreneurs, don't start entrepreneurship for the wrong reasons. Don't start entrepreneurship because it's the cool thing to do. Because you've seen these cool entrepreneurs that made a lot of money, and that's why you also want to be an entrepreneur. The entrepreneurial journey is a journey of pain. And the only thing that makes it worth it is the fact that there is a problem and a challenge that you fall in love with, that you really feel has to be solved, and that drives you. And that brings you that excitement of kind of pushing forward on trying again to solve that challenge. And that's what pushes you through the hard times. And the fact that you are innovating, you're doing something new, and it's again full of traps and full of hesitation. So start with for the right reason, and start by falling in love with that problem, no matter how cheesy that might sound like. That's the first piece of advice. The second piece of advice for those touching real estate that I could have used 9 years ago is like, try to, even if you're not a developer, try to become one, in the sense that try to learn as much as you can about how development actually works. Because that's going to allow you to put yourself in the shoes of developers, LPs, lenders. And the more you know about that, like the more you're going to be able to find a way to innovate. There was this quote, which I'm not going to say exactly correctly, but I think it was Picasso that said that you need to know the rules like a master so you can break them like an artist. And in some way, that is another key thing that a lot of, tech entrepreneurs, prop tech entrepreneurs do forget about. Everybody's enamored with their own solution, and it's important, which is what I'm trying to do these days. But I wish I had done it earlier. Like, try to get yourself truly in the shoes of the people you're trying to partner with. So that's the other more pragmatic, practical advice I would provide.
No, that's great feedback. Thank you so much for sharing that. And overall, Hasier, thank you for sharing Ory's story with us and giving our listeners a window into your vision for more optimized living opportunities, particularly in urban space, and even as you shared, kind of in Boise, outside of urban spaces as well. It's exciting to hear this feedback you've been sharing about, thinking through and helping us tackle the challenges of living in modern cities, of living in the environment we're in today with housing affordability challenges in all of our communities.
Jordan, wow. That conversation with Hasier was a real eye-opener for me. His vision was clear. He was trying to draw that straight line right between design and technology and laid out a vision. I think that those two issues are not just accessories, right? They're frontline tools if we're trying to fight the issue or fight for housing affordability, because obviously the cost of delivery and the efficiency with which we deliver product has a lot to do with whether or not we're on a path to achieving affordability. Was that your sentiment as well?
It was 100%. For me, it's really thinking about the cost of delivery. That is a key driver of housing affordability. We know from our years of experience of doing this type of development that land prices aren't going down, construction materials aren't going down, construction labor isn't getting any cheaper. So as we think about ways to drive housing affordability, for me, it's that cost of delivery, and that position how Hasier and the Ory Living team puts us in position to think about space a little bit differently, enables to think about spaces not as static, but as dynamic, in order to allow us to develop smaller spaces and therefore bring down our cost of delivery and introducing a new way to deliver housing affordability.
Yeah, you reminded me of a very important point, that costs never seem to go down once they go up. Back in 96, when the Olympics were coming, I was in the middle of working on some projects, and the costs had escalated dramatically over a period of months after the announcement of the Olympics. And so I put into my pro formas something called Olympic Premium, with the expectation that after the Olympics were over and time was passing, that premium would be declining or disappearing. Suffice it to say, it never moved down again. So that became the new baseline. And so you're right. Once the costs are there, they're never coming down. They're only going in one direction. So he reminded us of something that was very critical, and that is we all tend to look for legislative solutions to help drive innovation. So we needed legislation to tackle the issue of affordability and so on. And the truth is, what he was saying is we don't have to wait for legislation in order to innovate. We can start rethinking space and equity right now in what we do.
I agree. I think we all realize that policy change, legislation can take longer than the private market to step in. It can be actually harder to do legislation. And legislation doesn't always get the solution right? Legislation can lag what the market can do. And so I am grateful for innovators like Hasier that are willing to take those risks, able to secure that venture capital to support their efforts and start to drive new ways for us to do things. And then hopefully the legislation can catch up on the back end. But correct, in the times we are in today, with costs always remaining elevated, we need these types of private market solutions to help us find new paths forward.
And so you're identifying some of the things that came out of the conversation for you, and I did the same. And so I always ask, what, as you look back at that exchange, what resonated most with you? And also, if you think about that, were there any assumptions you had that were materially challenged by virtue of what you heard or what the dialogue with Hasier led to?
Yeah. Egbert, whenever we think about housing affordability, we typically think about low balancing tax credits, or we think about public subsidy. And what really resonated with me was Hasier reminding us, hey, there are ways to deliver new sources of naturally occurring affordable housing. That is new construction today. It doesn't have to be units that were built 25, 30 years ago in inferior locations, or, that are less amenity rich. They don't have to be units that have, poor wiring or poor or no sprinkler systems, right? He is enabling us to think differently. How do we tackle the problem with a design and technology approach that is new today, that enables us to be more creative in our performance and how we look to tackle these problems?
Absolutely, no doubt. In fact, he drew a straight line between affordability and efficiency, or lack of affordability and inefficiency, right?
That is absolutely correct, right? We continue to view spaces as static, right? We have a bedroom that is a bedroom 24 hours a day, despite the fact we might have the ability to put other purposes in there, whether that's a home office. And so, right, as we think about making spaces more dynamic, we think about making them more multi-purpose, we need less of the space, and that exactly helps us drive down our costs.
Yeah, and that point that you just made about the adaptability of space obviously translates into being able to offer more in the same space or offer more in less space, and ultimately that drives down the cost. And we need to be reminded that there are people on the other end of this transaction actually writing a check or making a payment in whatever form they choose for their housing, and therefore their families or individuals that pay the price for poor design or outdated construction practices, making them much more than just aesthetic issues, but actually having a very practical relevance to the average person.
Correct. And I think that people piece goes to what he challenged me to think about, is the fact, right, we think about smaller units, we think about very urban centers, New York City, Los Angeles. And the point he continues to make is the residents seek housing affordability no matter where they live, right? He has successful examples in Tampa. He has successful examples in Fort Worth, much less dense cities and communities. Yet it proves the fact that these residents are seeking lower chunk rents. They are seeking housing affordability. And if we can provide the same experience in that residential space, that meets their needs.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. I could say 3 more yeses behind that. In fact, and you said it earlier, you said we tend to default to looking at subsidy programs or the public sector, public incentives, or LIHTC, or other ways to address the issue of affordability. That's what we have been sort of indoctrinated to think about, because those have been the avenues for so long. But this conversation certainly was a reminder that real progress can be made in the fundamentals. And so if we take on the fundamentals, that is how we build, how we design, how we use space, etc., we get to ways of addressing affordability that aren't in keeping with how we have been preconditioned to think about it. What's your perspective on that?
I would agree. I think a lot of the fundamentals in which we develop by today, we've been carrying them forward from generation to generation, from decade to decade. The challenges we face, though, are only making those fundamentals harder to actually execute on.
Right.
And so, it's helpful to have policy tweaks. It's helpful to have these public subsidy problems that we've been using essentially as a crux for the last few decades of delivering housing affordability. But at some point in time, those fundamentals need to change and evolve in which the environment which we're operating in today, right? Technology has improved so much these days that there's got to be better ways for us to deploy within the projects themselves. And that's where I'm really grateful for what Hasier has been doing, right? It's helpful to have those type of innovators helping push us and help us rethink about those fundamentals, but also shows a continued role for the public subsidy to take, right? Public subsidy can help encourage and facilitate similar types of innovations that Hasier's put forward to help decrease the risk there, to help implement them in some demonstration projects and help scale up those solutions to other developers across the country.
Yeah. I relate to this and what you just said there, especially as it relates to looking at space differently and how we use it, how much of it we really need at any point in time, and how it changes over a family's lifetime or an individual's lifetime in terms of what they need in order to be effective in the space that they call home. And I'm reminded that my roommate in college, this is a few decades ago, his thesis was on, he had a vision of building an envelope, this fixed envelope, and then inside of that envelope, he had a whole bunch of different ways to manipulate the space. So as the family grew and you needed another little bedroom and so on and so forth, the outer shell was going to always be the same. There were a few ways that you could make some interesting changes there, but inside, with the recognition that today your family composition may not look like it will look in 2 or 3 years, or your challenges, whether it's mobility or other issues, may change over time, or you're studying, you're going back to school and you need an office and so on. None of those things should force you to have to leave. If you can, in fact, find a way to adapt the space so that you can live in the same space, but have it function in the way you need it to function in order for you to be effective in doing whatever you're doing. So it's never about how much space you have, but more so about how you actually use it or need to use it. How often it's activated, how often we're wasting space, etc. Right? That's really what it comes down to.
Correct. I think it's this changing of our viewpoint of how we should view space. We can view space as a service, space on demand, right? That's how we're thinking about entertainment today, with entertainment on demand with Hulu and Netflix and other providers, and transportation on demand with Lyft and Uber and other service providers. And I think Hasier's point here is we can also view space, residential space, with Ori as space on demand. That at times you could have a 1-bedroom unit with a living room, but if you have bring home a young baby from the hospital, that living room could easily become a nursery for that child. And so, right, space should be seen as what a household needs and needs to be able to adjust with us as a family continues to change.
Yeah, that really is. And that's a concept, really, a way to interpret it that most people today can relate to, and perhaps would not have been able to relate to a generation ago, or for that matter, 10 years ago, when there was no Lyft and Uber or whatever, because now people understand that using it on demand, or being able to call for it on demand as you need it, in the form you need it, and so on. And I love that analogy. And in a market where rent premiums are sky high, that question really does, or issue really does hit especially hard, right?
And that is the opportunity where Ori can step in and help provide those smaller spaces. But those residents, those tenants don't have to change their expectations of the space itself. The space can still function, be as functional as a larger unit would be. And so, correct, this is where I see Ori making a lot of traction.
So you're a developer, you're out there every day, you're trying to make numbers work, deals pencil, you're trying to differentiate your product from every other developer's. And that's what we really do. We're trying to show somebody why this particular housing solution or living arrangement offers them what they need, in this case, today and tomorrow. And so I think I know the answer to this, but do you think that Ori's model has the potential to shift how developers think about unit design, particularly when it comes to scaling smarter and more livable spaces? What do you think about that?
Yeah, again, Ori enables us to view spaces as dynamic. It allows us to view those spaces, again, particularly the spaces outside of a kitchen and a bathroom, as being multi-purpose, whether it's a living room at one point in time or a bedroom at another. So as we have this new viewpoint of spaces, it's going to force us to think differently about unit design.
Yeah, well, you know, you talk about unit design, most of the people that are creatives tend to think of that creative, the product that's the result of their creative exercise, to be the end game, the end in and of itself. And what was striking to me was that Hasier never really boasted or pounded his chest in this whole exercise. He was actually pretty humble as an entrepreneur, because really what he is doing is bringing about entrepreneurial solutions that people that have to make P&L decisions, profit and loss decisions, or make things work, so something very practical, that's really what he was doing. And he wasn't chasing innovation so that it could end up on a shelf and somebody could look back years later and say, oh, this was a great idea, it was before its time. He's trying to make it the right product for the right time, so that he isn't trying to sell some kind of silver bullet. He's basically saying, if these things are important to you as a developer, as an entrepreneur, here's why you should consider this product, and here's why it can be responsive in a way that the typical product today is not.
Yeah, Hasier started with that problem in mind, right? As we, as a world population, continue to grow, we're going to continue to face challenges around sustainability and challenges around affordability. So he and his team took those two problems in mind and started rethinking what a solution could look like. It did not start with tech in mind, as you shared. It started with, these are the problems, and where can we drive value? Where can we drive efficiency? How can we be smarter in thinking about solutions? And it just happened to be a technology solution, right? You know, as we think about a Murphy bed being introduced in the 1800s, right? Late 1800s when the Murphy bed was introduced, and there's really been no technology, really no evolution of that type of equipment until Hasier and the Ori Living team introduced their products within the last 10 years. So it's been amazing how little evolution's happened to a Murphy bed. In fact, my wife and I built a new house just a few years ago, and we installed a Murphy bed in a brand new house just a few years ago. So again, there was no other option for us. I called Ori and the Hasier team and said, hey, can I purchase one of your cloud beds, put it in our bedroom? Because our bedroom is also where my home office is, and also where my wife and I work out. And so again, it's taking that dynamic use of a space, but Murphy bed was all we could find at that point in time.
You should call it a Jones bed, but I get it. No, you're right. The intentionality and empathy with which he went about the work is clearly reflected, right? And as I said in my earlier comments, he was addressing real world problems. That's what he was tackling. And so I love it. I love it for a whole lot of reasons. Let me ask you, in your view, does his approach reflect the kind of innovation that the industry actually needs? I think I know the answer is yes, yes, yes. You've said it a number of different ways. And is it fair to say that this starts with people, not profit? Because, we've come at it trying to produce a solution that is going to make the deal work. But the truth is, the deal working doesn't ensure long-term usability of the product. That only can happen if the people that use it want to continue to use it over time, right? So fair to say it starts with people and not with profit, right?
Correct. The people-centered approach that 𝗪𝗂𝘂 are taking is what's, in my opinion, driving this to be a sustainable solution that all communities across the country will be able to accept. It's this kind of empathy-driven innovation that is so rare in our space that we see 𝗪𝗂𝘂 doing, is focusing on the people, and that will make it a sustainable solution.
Well said. Well said. All right. Well, we're coming to the end, and what I would say here, Jordan, is that Ory reminds us that housing's future doesn't always come down to a choice between efficiency and humanity. It can actually address both, and we should build smarter and more compassionately, period. But first, we have to challenge all the things we've been doing over and over. When you hear somebody say, well, this is how we do it, or this is how we've always done it, and you're really just learning to repeat the same inefficiencies or ineffective strategies that have been put in place and embraced from earlier periods, and you really don't make the change. So once you challenge those assumptions, which shape so much of how we build today, then that sort of opens the door for innovation. And so, Jordan, I want to say thank you for helping us navigate our way through this very, very rich conversation. And a special thanks to Hasier for showing us that design, when done with purpose, can be a very powerful instrument for equity. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Egbert.
Next time on Create the Village.
We want to create an ecosystem of legacy builders, and we are all we're solving for today and tomorrow.
Create the Village is produced by Felicia Ann Rosennuha and Chantrell Brewer. Executive producer Rick White. It's edited by Brennan Robinson. Create the Village is a production of the Integral Group LLC, copyright 2025.